American Civil War. The war began in April 1861 when young cadets from the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, opened fire on the harbor fortification Fort Sumter, the last federal stronghold in the state. For almost exactly 4 years, the war would rage across the country from Pennsylvania to Kansas to Louisiana. If you were to ask the average American what caused the Civil War, they would immediately answer slavery. While true, this is an oversimplification. We may look at the causes of the American Civil War from a variety of perspectives, and each of the explanations that historians have proposed shed light on the tremendous influences of politics, economics, and culture that helped sway over the men and women who lived in our country 150 years ago. When we dig deeper, though, we do find that the question of slavery was at the root of each of these proposed theories. The second most common theory after slavery to explain the cause of the Civil War is the issue of states' rights. This theory revolves around the relationship between the national government and the states as outlined in the Constitution. According to the 10th Amendment, all powers not specifically granted to the federal government are reserved for the states or for the people. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, and James Madison, author of the Constitution, were the first American statesmen to stand up against an abusive federal power as a result of the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. This is only 7 years after the Constitution and Bill of Rights were finally ratified. John C. Calhoun continued in the same vein in 1830, as his theory of nullification caused the first major constitutional crisis in the young nation, when his compatriots in South Carolina attempted to block the collection of a very high federally imposed import tax. Slave ownership had always been defined by state law, not federal. But by 1860, the United States had acquired vast amounts of territory in the West. Attempts by Northern politicians, known as free soilers, to stop the spread of slavery into these federally owned territories led Southerners to argue that those lands were the joint and common property of all Americans. Many slave owners feared that if the national government could prohibit slavery in these federally controlled territories, nothing could prevent them from doing the same within the sovereign states. The federal government, argued these Southerners, could not prevent Americans from bringing their property, including slaves, into the territories, and in 1857, the United States Supreme Court agreed with them. So in 1860, secession becomes a way for these Southerners to stand up for what they see is the true meaning of the Constitution: to protect the states and the people from an overbearing national government that they believed was trying to take away their property. We need only look at the Great Seal of the Confederate States, George Washington upon his horse, to see that the southern states viewed themselves as the descendants of the Founding Fathers. Cultural and economic differences might also help to explain why the Civil War erupted in the mid-19th century. The South lived its life slowly in the heat and humidity, close to the land, with a lifestyle controlled by the seasons, and with a relatively homogeneous ruling class. The North, by contrast, was cold, was becoming more and more urban, with a diverse society of immigrants who lived their lives more attuned to the clock than to the seasons. Some historians argue that these differences inevitably led to conflict between the regions that could not be dampened for very long. Yet many of these distinctions can themselves be traced to the institution of slavery. The heat and humidity allowed for a long growing season in the South, ideal for the cultivation of cash crops like cotton. Cotton was both a blessing and a curse for the South. The cotton gin, invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, made cotton cultivation profitable. These profits were then reinvested in the things that generated wealth: more land and more slaves. By comparison, early profits generated by shipping and manufacturing in the northern states were invested in emerging industries and in a more diversified economy. This attracted immigrants who came to America for new opportunities. They were less likely to come to the southern states because the unskilled and domestic jobs that they performed in the north were already being performed by slaves in the south. Some historians will blame politicians for the war, men who worked to attain their own narrow goals or who refused to compromise. Men like Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who threw over the Missouri Compromise in place for over 25 years, simply to gain a northerly route for the Transcontinental Railroad, where Chicago was the hub. Men like the so-called fire eaters, who stirred up rabid pro-slavery and pro-secession sentiment and led Southerners to walk out of the 1860 Democratic National Convention when they didn't get what they wanted in the party platform. Yet when we stop to examine the issue over which these politicians were continually fighting or refusing to compromise, we see once again slavery. Yes, slavery was the irrepressible conflict in the United States before 1860. Despite a wide variety of explanations, ultimately, the question of slavery can be traced as the root cause of the American Civil War. Despite the fact that the war really began over the question of slavery, the final goal was not about abolishing it outright. Abraham Lincoln was an adamant free soiler in that he wanted to prohibit the expansion of slavery into the federal territories. While he and many congressmen desired abolition, the official policy of the Northern government at the beginning of the war was simply to preserve the Union. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln said, "In view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states." The following year, he wrote to newspaper editor Horace Greeley, "I would save the Union. I would save it the shortest way under the Constitution. The sooner the national authority can be restored, the nearer the Union will be to the Union as it was." By the fall of 1862, however, Lincoln needed a strategy to change the trajectory of the war. The initial energy of Southern troops, their desire to protect their homes, and their large proportion of well-trained military leaders led to a number of significant Confederate victories in the first 2 years of the war. In September of 1862, Yankee and rebel forces clashed at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. During the previous month, the Confederates had won every major battle, and even the Battle of Antietam was really just fought to a draw, as it was the bloodiest single day of the war, with over 22,000 casualties. By comparison, the total Allied casualties at the Battle of Normandy in World War II, or the invasion of Normandy, were only 12,000 people. But Antietam was a strategic victory for the Union, as it blocked Lee's advance into Maryland. Lincoln took advantage of that strategic victory by issuing the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And in the process, he changed the course of the war and the American Republic. In this document, Lincoln used his war powers as Commander-in-Chief of the American military to declare that all slaves in states currently in rebellion were to be considered free as of January 1st, 1863. Some historians have argued that the Emancipation Proclamation was a remarkably conservative document. Only those slaves in areas currently in rebellion were set free. Slave states that had not seceded from the Union, like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, were allowed to keep their slaves. Nor were Union-occupied portions of the South, including much of South Louisiana, included in the proclamation. States who chose to rejoin the Union before January 1st would theoretically also be able to keep their slaves.